Welcome to this presentation titled The Role of Place in Fashion Innovation and Production in Kenya, a case study of collaborative voucher scheme projects funded by the AHSCE Nairobi. My name is Waithira Kibuchi and I will be your presenter. This study is drawn from the main African Hub for Sustainable Creative Economies AHSCE project led by Professor Roberta Communion from King's College London, Dr. Lauren England from King's College London, and Dr. Brian Rags from the University of Southampton. The project aimed to facilitate the sharing of knowledge and networks between African higher education institutions and stakeholders, such as creative entrepreneurs, intermediaries, and policymakers in their creative economies. It was carried out in collaboration with 3 African universities, the University of Nairobi, the University of Lagos, and the University of the Witwatersrand. The lead investigator at the University of Nairobi was Ms. Ogake Mosomi. I worked as the Creative Partnership Coordinator for the Nairobi Hub, leveraging networks within the industry to support and coordinate the project's activities. For this presentation, I will start off by introducing the background literature on the geographies of fashion production, the Kenyan clothing, textile, and apparel industry, and the rural as a site of creative work. I will then introduce the methods and case studies used for this research and present the findings focusing on themes of fashion production in rural and urban spaces. I will also offer considerations to take into account when navigating rural spaces and then present the conclusions and reflections for future research. Background literature on geographies of creative production indicates a bias towards the urban in narratives of creative clusters. When it comes to fashion specifically, the industry has actively used geographical strategies of association and dissociation to create and reproduce hierarchies of value, bringing certain spaces, places, and people into high relief, while masking the global inequalities, abuses of labor, standards, and environmental catastrophes that underpin the industry. Fashion production in Africa is generally portrayed as urban, with significant fashion hubs in cities such as Lagos, Dakar, and Johannesburg. This is linked to the presence of networks and infrastructure that make it possible to create, disseminate, and present fashion to both local and global audiences. This narrative prioritizes downstream image and idea-making activities such as marketing, retail, and distribution over upstream material-making activities such as fiber and garment production. In Africa, a considerable amount of upstream activities rely on locally sourced raw materials and traditional textile and craft skills which are located in rural areas. Data on the Kenyan clothing, textile, and apparel industry indicates that there are 40,000 small-scale cotton farmers, 10 active ginneries, 15 operational textile mills, and, in the design and sewing segment, 22 large foreign-owned companies, 170 medium and large, and over 75,000 small and micro enterprises. The individuals and firms engaging in the fiber to fashion value chain are located throughout the country. 90% of cotton farming takes place in arid and semi-arid regions, while about 50% of textile and garment manufacture takes place in Nairobi. The other 50% comes from neighboring and distant counties. There is a growing body of research on the rural as a site of creative work, such as Harvey, Hawkins, and Thomas's exploration of relations occurring across and beyond a small rural-based cluster in the UK, and Drummond and Snowball's investigation on how the presence of cultural and creative industries in non-metropolitan spaces relates to levels of socioeconomic development. However, research on creative work in rural areas, especially in non-Western contexts, remains limited. I will now give an overview of the methods used to conduct this study. As part of its activities, the AHSCE implemented a collaborative voucher scheme to kickstart collaborations between industry and academia. 8 creative short-term collaborative fashion-related projects in Nairobi were awarded £1,000 in Kenya shillings each to carry out their proposed activities. Working as the Creative Partnership Coordinator, I conducted 4 follow-up interviews with the voucher scheme participants over 6 months to support and document the collaborations. Of the 8 projects awarded funding, 3 were carried out across urban and rural spaces, and they covered both upstream and downstream activities. The connections between Nairobi and the networked rural areas traversed by these voucher scheme projects provide valuable insights into urban-rural connections and the role of rural clusters in fashion production in Kenya. These 3 projects form the basis for this study. For analysis, a process-focused approach to comparison is adopted with an emphasis on cross-cutting themes and practices. I am now going to give an overview of the 3 case studies. A bridal kiondo was a collaboration between Winnie Odande, stylist and creative director at Dande Styles, a fashion styling agency, and Ivy Nita, founder of Kiondo Culture, a social enterprise working with artisans from Chekoyo village in eastern Kenya to produce shiondo. The kiondo is a hand-woven basket made using a spiral technique with plain sisal fiber for the warp and colorful yarn for the weft to enclose symbolic, coded cultural narratives. It was given to women on their wedding day to mark their passage from girlhood into womanhood. Winnie and Ivy reworked the traditional form into 3 designs, one for each stage of a typical Kenyan wedding. The first for the indigenous dowry ceremony known as the rorashio, the second for the white church wedding, and the third for the honeymoon. They worked with weavers in Chekoyo village to translate the designs and brought the shiondo back to Nairobi to oversee the bidding and finishing. The entire product development process was documented and the output posted on their YouTube and social media pages. Luo Women and Power in Fashion was a collaboration between Sharon Wendo, jewelry designer at Epica Jewelry, Ida Aluoch, swimwear designer at Parkswear, and Judy Rose Semo, stylist at Nyandisa Styling. The Luo are a Nilotic-speaking community native to the area near Lake Victoria in western Kenya. The 3 collaborators, who are Luo, were looking to create a collection with a cohesive visual Luo identity for future fashion-related references. Sharon designed beaded accessories to adorn models dressed in swimwear designed by Ida, and Judy styled the collection using headpieces, feathers, animal skin, and woven baskets. They then traveled to Kisumu, a city on the shores of Lake Victoria, with a photographer and videographer to shoot 6 looks around the lake and within the city. They also documented the process and posted it on their social media pages. Malisafi was a collaboration between Anita Barbara, who is an art director, Grace Dunge, fashion designer at Zakara, Kenya, and Charles Gudhua, who is a filmmaker. Malisafi is a slang Swahili term used to describe products of high quality. This project aimed to demonstrate that fashion can be created and consumed sustainably in Kenya by documenting entrepreneurs who are using sustainable techniques and processes. They filmed the slow production of textiles and garments within Nairobi and later traveled to Lake Magadi, the southernmost lake in the Kenyan Rift Valley, to shoot images of clothing sourced from sustainable fashion brands. The key findings of this study emerge along the themes of idea generation, inputs, social values, and dynamics of work. Where does the inspiration come from? What inputs are used and where are they situated? Which values do the practitioners prioritize in each space? And how do the creative workers organize themselves in their work? When it comes to idea generation, inspiration can and is drawn from both rural and urban spaces. The desire to modernize the kiondo came from noticing how out of place it seemed when juxtaposed against a more contemporary, luxurious African lifestyle. For Ida, the desire to create a swimwear brand came from childhood memories of swimming naked in Lake Victoria, and for Anita, The desire to tell African stories authentically came from watching European movies and exhibitions telling incomplete stories. When it comes to inputs, rural spaces excel at providing raw materials, indigenous knowledge, and traditional craft skills, while urban spaces orient towards conceptualization, design direction, and digital skills. Sisal, the main raw material for the shiondo, is grown in rural areas. The baskets are typically woven by women's groups residing in these areas, and they remain the custodians for these skills. On the other hand, it is easier to access skills such as design direction, photography, videography, and social media in urban spaces. Creatives tend to prioritize different social values when interacting within each space. In rural areas, it is all about memory, authenticity, and cultural heritage. The Luo Women Empower team felt the need to travel to Lake Victoria area to get into the spirit of home and tell their story authentically. Urban areas, on the other hand, tend to be about modernization, globalization, and the future. Creatives operating in these spaces want to be recognized not just locally but also internationally, and they are very strategic in their social media use. The dynamics of work presenting in each space also vary. Creatives working in rural areas tend to work in or belong to community groups as a way of increasing their collective producing and bargaining power. The Luo Women Empower team, for example, had to obtain prior approval from the Dunga Beach Committee before accessing the lake area for their shoot. Shiondo weavers in eastern Kenya also tend to work on projects as a group, making the baskets in their homes individually and aggregating them to fulfill orders. Creatives in urban spaces, on the other hand, tend to work individually or in a small team of people with complementary skills. Some professional groups do exist, but work is rarely aggregated through them. The findings also shed light on some considerations for creatives trying to navigate rural spaces. First, speaking the native language or having a translator can be of advantage when interacting with rural communities. It would have been difficult or downright impossible for Winnie to communicate with the Shiondo weavers had Ivy, who speaks the local language, not been present. Likewise, the Malisafi team relied on one of the models to negotiate the cost of accessing the Lake Magadi area in their local language. Accessing the creative communities working in rural spaces also depends on the extent of your network. These communities rarely have a digital footprint. To access them, you either have to know them personally or be introduced or referred by someone. The Bridal Kiondo team, for example, had wanted to work with a famed Kiondo community based in Kitui, but they had to find an alternative when they could not locate them. Cultural intermediaries also play a critical role in accessing rural spaces. The contact from the Dunga Beach Committee not only assisted the Luo Women Empower in Fashion team to access the space, he also shared some local knowledge such as the best time to shoot and what time the fishermen came in. He was also known and trusted by the local people, and this allowed the team to focus on creating their content rather than negotiating and explaining themselves everywhere they went. Farm size also has implications for accessing rural spaces. The timeline that the Bridal Kiondo team had set for their project had to be delayed by a few weeks since the women they were working with had received an order from a larger and better paying client. Likewise, the area around Lake Victoria is a popular location for shoots by firms of all sizes, including some large corporates like Safaricom, the largest telecommunications provider in Kenya. This puts smaller creatives wanting to access these spaces at a disadvantage because the rural communities prioritize the large corporates. In conclusion, dominant narratives of fashion production prioritize downstream image-making activities over upstream material-making activities, and while the former tend to be located in urban spaces, the latter are just as likely to occur in rural spaces. Both downstream and upstream activities are crucial to fashion production. There is a need to broaden research on creative work in rural areas and more specifically on rural geographies of fashion production in non-Western contexts. These This research uses case studies of 3 voucher scheme projects funded by the AHSCE Nairobi to explore themes of idea generation, inputs, social values and dynamics of work presenting in both rural and urban spaces, and reflects on the role played by language, network access, cultural intermediaries and farm size in navigating rural spaces for fashion production. The connections between Nairobi and networked rural areas traversed by these projects provide valuable insights into urban-rural connections and the role of rural clusters in fashion production in Kenya. These insights can be leveraged for the development of the creative economy in Kenya and in similar contexts. Thank you for listening. You can find out more about the AHSCE project at creativeeconomiesafrica.org. My contact details are on this slide and I welcome any inquiries about this study.